Olá, pessoal. Novamente muito bom estar aqui com vocês. Para quem não me conhece, eu sou o Marcelo Cabral. Eu sou o host aqui do nosso canal de entrevistas Entre Mundus, que é uma das facetas do nosso jornal online Unus Mundus, por sinal. É um jornal online, uma revista online que a gente lançou há algum tempo, com muita energia, com muita empolgação, com artigos, ensaios, podcasts, vários tipos de mídia, todos gratuitos, explorando a interface entre as ciências, a filosofia e a teologia, com um time muito grande de convidados e especialistas dissertando, escrevendo, refletindo sobre vários temas, pontos de vistas fundamentais nessa interação. Então a gente convida vocês para irem no Google agora, colocarem Unus Mundus, navegarem pelo site, verem os diversos artigos, ensaios que a gente tem lá, se deliciarem com um verdadeiro banquete intelectual que a gente tem disponibilizado com muito amor, muito empenho para vocês. E a gente tem uma preocupação de oferecer conteúdos fundamentais e de alta qualidade. Numa época em que nós estamos saturados de informação, a era informacional, mas ao mesmo tempo em que a nossa capacidade de atenção parece que nunca foi tão reduzida. Como diz T.S. Eliot, o grande poeta, vivemos na era do conhecimento, mas nunca nos faltou tanta sabedoria para saber nos apropriar do conhecimento, porque é um ambiente em que, ao mesmo tempo que nós temos bons conhecimentos, a gente tem fake news, em que a gente tem informação, isso vem misturado com muita desinformação, em que nós temos belíssimas teorias misturadas com teorias da conspiração, em que a gente tem comunidades de conhecimento virtuosas misturadas com bolhas, com câmeras de eco, em que todo tipo de loucura é propagada e disseminada. E exatamente para conversar sobre esses vários temas que tocam o conhecimento humano e nossa interação com eles, é com muita alegria que eu anuncio o nosso convidado de hoje, que é o professor Jeroen de Ridder, que ele é professor de Epistemologia Política ou da cadeira de Conhecimento em Filosofia na Sociedade pela Faculdade de Humanidades do Departamento de Filosofia da Universidade Livre de Amsterdã. Ele também é professor por apontamento especial de Filosofia Cristã da Faculdade de Teologia e Estudos Religiosos da Universidade de Groningen. Professor, it's a very, very, very pleasure for us to having you here today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah, so today we'll be talking with Professor Jeroen de Ridder. That's right?
Yeah, Jeroen de Ridder.
Jeroen de Ridder. Okay, one day I will learn. I will try to learn Dutch. But it's a very pleasure for us to have us here. Professor, he's been teaching political epistemology at the Free University of Amsterdam, and he's also professor of Christian philosophy at the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Groningen.
Correct.
So just to begin, Professor, tell us a little bit of yourself. Who are you? Maybe this is our biggest philosophical question to begin with.
Yeah. So, as you just said, I'm Jeroen de Ridder. I teach philosophy in Amsterdam and Groningen. I'm married. I have 4 kids. I am a first-generation student and now first-generation scholar. So it wasn't, to start with, it wasn't very likely that I would end up being a professor. But my life sort of developed in a way that I did end up becoming a professor, and I have to say it's a wonderful life. I mean, it really, for me, it always felt as if I could sort of make my hobby into my work. I mean, I sort of began to love philosophy when I was in college, and now I ended up being a philosophy professor, so I can basically do philosophy full time. And of course, I also have to sit in meetings and do admin work, but still, I get to do a lot of philosophy, which is really wonderful.
That's amazing. And was there like a specific moment when you realize, wow, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life? Maybe after reading a book or after a course in college, something like that.
Yeah, so I guess I wouldn't say it was one specific moment. It was more of a process, I guess. But certainly one thing that played an important role is that I got bored with engineering. So I was trained as an engineer before I became a philosopher. And during my time at the at Delft University of Technology, where I was trained, I sort of discovered philosophy because I didn't know anything at all really about philosophy before. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know it was an academic discipline. I didn't know it was something that people could do for a living. But while I was in college studying as an engineer, I sort of read philosophy books just through friends in college who gave me books. I mean, one book I remember that did make a big impression on me was Arthur Schopenhauer's book on free will. And I guess, I mean, Schopenhauer's writing style and the topic of free will, it really, I mean, it fascinated me. Of course, I had at the time I had no idea what how plausible it all was, and whether or not Schopenhauer was right or how idiosyncratic his ideas were. But still, I mean, I thought this was like a really fascinating topic. And then I went on to read books in philosophy of science. So, for instance, Karl Popper. I tried to read some Immanuel Kant, which is really hard to do.
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, to be honest. But anyway, so I sort of gradually discovered philosophy as a discipline. And then when I finished my training as an engineer, I figured, hey, why not try and do this philosophy thing for real? So then I enrolled in a philosophy graduate program, and well, the rest is history.
That's very, very nice. So, well, but how did you went from Schopenhauer to analytic epistemology? So, what was the bridge between these two very different worlds? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fair question. Yeah, they are quite different. Although, I mean, I guess sort of one thing that is good about Schopenhauer, his arguments are pretty clear sometimes. I mean, he cares a lot about clear arguments, which, I mean, he has that in common with analytic philosophy, I think. But anyway, so maybe something of the engineering approach sort of stuck in me after all, because analytic philosophy is sort of characterized by emphasizing clarity of arguments, sharp definitions of concepts that are used in philosophy, attempts to reconstruct arguments very precisely by giving premises and then checking whether conclusions follow logically from the premises. So in a way, it's sort of it's almost a mathematical approach to philosophy, you might say. So maybe sort of my exact brain, sort of trained as an engineer, really sort of latched on to this style of doing philosophy. And I guess, it also, I mean, it clicked with me. I figured, I mean, if we're going to think about these really big and abstract topics, then, we should be clear about what we mean. I mean, we can't just throw around words like human nature and free will and soul and not be very precise about what we mean.
You are right. I began my own career in philosophy in more a continental tradition. Here in Brazil, most of schools are in traditional bent, but gradually I moved towards the analytical tradition as well, and this passion for precision and trying to be clear about what we are talking about. It's really important. That's right. So let's move on. If I'm right, recently you were appointed to the chair of political epistemology at the Freie University. Is that right?
That is right, yeah.
So maybe this term political epistemology may trick at least our audience a little bit.
Sure.
So let's start with epistemology. Okay, what is epistemology?
Sure. So, very briefly, epistemology is the theory of knowledge. So, as a philosophical subdiscipline, epistemology is about questions that have to do with knowledge. So, first of all, one big central question has always been, what knowledge is, basically. So trying to give a precise definition, an analysis of knowledge. And one very sort of well-known candidate here is the idea that knowledge is justified through belief. So in order to know something, you have to believe it, it has to be true, and you have to have some justification for what you believe. So you need to have arguments or perceptions, observations that support your belief. But it's not just about the analysis of knowledge. I mean, it's also to do with concepts like evidence, rationality, reliability, in the sense of arriving at true beliefs and avoiding false ones. It's about intellectual virtues and vices, so sort of character habits, character traits that make you a good thinker or a bad one. So people try to analyze features like open-mindedness or creativity or intellectual perseverance, intellectual courage. So epistemology really is about lots of different questions that have to do with knowledge. Also the limits, the bounds of knowledge. Are there things about which we simply cannot have knowledge? Yeah, that's it, basically.
Yes. Do you have like one or two heroes in epistemology, maybe in your earlier days when you were starting reading about epistemology, one or two authors that really stuck you and you maybe, wow, this is really great, this is really amazing?
Yeah. So I think one name that immediately comes to my mind is Bill Alston. He was an American philosopher, a Christian American philosopher, but also a really amazing epistemologist. And I think, I mean, one thing I admire about him is sort of the combination of his sort of analytical thought. So he is really precise and careful and sort of rigorous in his arguments. But at the same time, I guess his writing isn't always very accessible or colloquial, but it's funny. It's sort of funny in a dry way. I mean, he has these sort of expressions and phrases that are, sort of slang or colloquial language sometimes. But I think, he has really made some extremely important contributions to contemporary epistemology, just things that really sort of impacted a big discussion. And that's something to admire, obviously, if you have the capacity of really, changing a discussion or putting a new topic on the agenda. That's quite something.
I'm sure, yes. So let's move to the political part, because maybe for most of people, when you say political epistemology, the political part draws immediately us to partisan disputes or like political debates of the day. But I think it's not exactly that political means in this chair, right? So what political stays for, or what topics are you covering in your research as a political epistemologist?
So I think, political epistemology is really about questions that are at the intersection of knowledge and politics and society, you might say. So, for example, one question, obviously a very relevant one nowadays, has to do with misinformation and disinformation. So what exactly is disinformation? How does it impact people's beliefs about what is going on in the world, what is going on in society and politics? Because the worry that a lot of people have is that misinformation, disinformation are distorting public discourse in societies. And in doing so, it might undermine the quality of democratic deliberation, of debate that we have in society. So this is one topic that is really sort of central to political epistemology because it has to do with the role that knowledge plays in politics and society. Another example of a topic that has been written about in political epistemology is the question whether democracy itself can be a knowledge-producing system. So, we usually think of science or the law or things like that as knowledge-producing systems, but you might think there's also an argument for democracy being a knowledge-producing system, because when we organize things well, democracy has the potential of bringing together all the citizens, or at least a representation of citizens in a society, to bring them together and to share their perspectives, their arguments, their insights, their knowledge. And then when they do that, and when they deliberate well, so they argue about their positions, they listen to each other, they adjust their own beliefs, together they can learn. So by having democratic institutions that bring together this diversity of perspectives and then have people learn from each other, eventually you might think the truth is going to come out, is going to come to the surface. Or, I mean, maybe not only the truth, but also solutions, sort of policy ideas that are acceptable to everyone. So in that way, democracy itself might even be a knowledge-producing system. So I intentionally say it might be, because we all know examples. I mean, I'm sure you do in Brazil, we do here in the Netherlands. We've seen examples from the US where democracy doesn't at all seem to produce knowledge. I mean, in fact, it seems to do the opposite. It only confuses people, or produces a lot of disinformation. So it's a bit of an idealistic picture, maybe, but it seems like in principle it can work.
Yes, this is fascinating, but also a very idealized view, right?
Sure.
So I'm thinking now in the great Michael Polanyi, who once, I think, he speaks something like that democracy depends on science to survive, depends on a kind of free science to thrive. And science, on the other hand, can only really thrive in a democratic society. So would you agree with him, or it's too big topic to...
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, because the relation between science and democracy, or scientific experts and democratic citizens, is in fact also another topic in political epistemology. And it's a tricky one, because there is a bit of tension between democratic ideals and sort of ideals of science or expertise. And so the tension is this. I mean, in democracy, we think that each person gets one vote. Each person's opinion is worth just as much as the next person. But when we think about science or scientific experts in relation to their specialized knowledge about particular topics, take the case of climate change, for example, right? I mean, we wouldn't want to say that everyone's opinions about climate change are just as good, right? We think certain people, climate scientists, know a lot more about climate change than do other people, ordinary citizens. So when it comes to democracy and democratic decision-making, you might say, well, there's things that pull in opposite directions. On the one hand, we want every citizen to have one vote, but on the other, if we're serious about expertise, we might want to say, well, the opinions or the votes of the experts should count for a little more. Maybe should get some extra weight. So this is tricky, right? It looks like we have an ideal that has to do with politics and equality and inclusion on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have an ideal that has to do with expertise and gathering knowledge, using knowledge in the right way. And they pull in opposite directions. So I think this is sort of, it's a tricky balance. We need to, I think ideally what we would want, and sometimes it does work that way when things go well, we want the experts to inform public debate, right? And we want citizens to trust experts, to trust the right experts, and to adjust their views based on the evidence that these experts provide. And of course, when they do so, they will then make the right choices. I mean, the right in the sense of, they will vote for effective policies, politicians who are willing to implement these effective policies.
Yeah.
Again, I realize in saying this, this is a very optimistic picture, and it's not at all what we've seen happening in, for some topics at least.
Yeah, so it's hard to pinpoint exactly when, but it seems that in the last years, a kind of anti-science attitude or perception, or even explicitly anti-science communities have been growing all over the world. Like famous, some prime minister of some country said, "We are done with the experts." And so what an epistemologist could say about trusting science, and how should we, who are not scientists, we don't have the expertise to assess what the scientists are saying, how should we trust science?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question again. And I think, there's no easy answer here. I can't just give people a recipe for saying, oh, take these steps and then you will end up, trusting the right people and you will know for sure, what is true and what is false. So maybe a couple of remarks. So first, you are right that there, at least in some segments of the population, there's been growing distrust in science. At the same time, I don't think we should sort of exaggerate the amount to which that is a general attitude in the population. I think most people still think of science, or at least most science, as a pretty reliable source of knowledge. So it's certainly true for some smaller groups, on the fringes, you might say, but it's certainly not a very general attitude among citizens. And second, insofar as people distrust science, it's usually, pretty specific bits and pieces of science that they distrust, right? So it's the science about climate, for example. It might be the science about genetically modified organisms. There's another science about the safety of vaccines. So there's like a few topics where people are really distrustful, or at least some people are really distrustful. But I don't think I've seen, science skeptics not using their iPhones anymore or not getting on planes, right? Apparently, a lot of people, everyone almost, still trusts a lot of the sciences in other areas.
Yeah.
All right. So having said this, there's still a worry here about, how to pick the right experts and whom to trust. And I think, the way to trust science is certainly not to try and think for yourself about the actual content of science. Because as you say, science is a super specialized endeavor. You have to have a lot of training and specialized knowledge to assess the quality or the trustworthiness of specific scientific claims. And as an outsider, as a layperson who's not a scientist themselves, this is just impossible to do. So the trick is you need to think for yourself about whom to trust. So you need to think about who are the experts and which ones can I trust. How do you do that? You can look for certain markers of credibility, reputation, and usually, you can look at, training of scientists. Were they trained at prestigious or good universities? Are they, active in their field, still doing research, still publishing? That's something you can look for. Another thing to look for is the question, is this expert speaking on a topic about which he or she is an actual expert, right? When a physicist starts to talk about philosophy, his or her opinion might not be worth as much. My opinion about physics isn't worth much, so it goes in both directions. So are people speaking in their area of expertise? And another, I think, really important thing to look for is whether scientists speak of a consensus in their field. Because when there's a consensus in their field, in some cases, it doesn't automatically mean that it's true. But certainly when there's a consensus, that's a pretty good indication that what scientists are saying is more likely to be true. There's a consensus on gravity. There's a consensus on, safety of vaccines. So that gives you a pretty strong indication that this is something you can trust a scientist for. When there's a lot of debate in a scientific discipline, when people disagree, then, maybe just, listen to their opinions, but don't put your faith in any particular opinion in the debate. So consensus is another good indication.
Oh, that's
so there's a whole list of indicators, but I do realize it's still going to be a complex question, and people might reasonably disagree about who the best and the most reliable experts are. There isn't always an easy answer.
No, that's this is a very, very complex stuff, but it's very important that epistemologists are, inquiring and trying to investigate the various factors that bear importance in this matter, right? So, a related matter, as you said, probably most of people still trust science, and even those who distrust, they don't distrust science in general, right? There are some theories or some claims that usually clash with their particular values or background beliefs or something that raise some concerns in these communities or in these people. And it seems, and empirical data points in this direction, that most groups who distrust science are religious groups, religious communities. So there is empirical data, for instance, that most people who embrace conspiracy theories are religious people, many of them Christians, for instance, in the United States. So, this is a tricky question, but my first question in this sense would be, is science and religion in conflict? I mean, does religion imply a kind of denial of the scientific method, scientific findings, or the whole scientific stance, to use Van Fraasen's famous expression? What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is almost a topic for a separate interview. I mean, the relation between science and religion, but
You're right.
even so. So I think, I mean, I do realize the claim that there is this deep and enduring conflict between science and religion is a very popular one. I mean, a lot of people believe this. It has been, propagated in books and in talks. But I mean, the first thing I always say, when you think about this claim from a purely historical perspective, you just look to the history of science and the history of philosophy more broadly. It's just a bizarre claim. Because, I mean, when we limit ourselves only to modern science, so, starting from the 16th century, say 17th century and forward, pretty much most of the big scientific geniuses that everyone always talks about, so people like Galileo Galilei, Kepler, Isaac Newton, and so on and so forth, Richard Boyle, I mean, most of the founders of the Royal Society in Britain, virtually all of them were religious believers. So the idea that science and religion must be in tension, must be at war, it just doesn't make sense historically. So that's the first remark. And even when you sort of delve deeper into like some of these well-known examples that people often give, like Galileo versus the church, the Catholic Church at the time, or Darwin's evolutionary theory and Christianity. In those cases, there's been, over the past decades, really exceptional historical work. And in each and every case, I mean, you can tell this story pretty much analogously for every example of historical conflict. In each case, the story turns out to be a lot more complicated and nuanced. And the conflict, I mean, there was a real conflict, sure. I'm not denying there were historical conflicts there. But the conflict was much more between individuals, characters, and things they did and like particular beliefs they held than a general conflict between science and religion. I mean, to mention just one example, Galileo was just a very sort of socially inept person, it seems. He basically got lots of opportunities to write about his views, explain his views, but instead he chose to insult the Pope. Well, you might think that's a bad idea. Sure.
After the Reformation, I have to remember, right? And the whole tension in terms of the authority in the Catholic Church, and he chose to challenge and even insult the Pope.
Exactly. So, I mean, you might think, still he should not have been locked up for that, and maybe that's true. But the point is, I mean, there was a lot going on then, and it certainly wasn't the case that the church was really against anything that Galileo said on behalf of science. And the same is true for Darwin. So, I mean, the whole history of science and religion conflicts or alleged conflicts is, you have nuanced histories. And in addition to these conflicts, there's also cases where scientific claims and religious claims really sort of came together really nicely. So think about the origins of the Big Bang Theory, like the account of how the universe first evolved. It was a Belgian Catholic priest, Georges Lemaitre, who first came up with that idea. So, I mean, to think that there's always this conflict is just historically false.
Yeah, very
So
good.
I think what's really going on a lot of the times is that there are conflicts between certain interpretations of religion and certain interpretations of science. So it's not religion as a whole, and it's not science as a whole, but it's a certain version of a religion and a certain interpretation of scientific claims or results that clash. And of course, I mean, the obvious example here is, the theory of evolution versus a literal reading of the first chapters of the book of Genesis, right? I mean, if you read the first chapters of the book of Genesis really literally, it sort of looks like the Earth is, 6 to maybe 10,000 years old. When you look at these histories and you try and count the numbers, when you take that and you look at data from geology, from biology, of course there's a conflict there. But then again, as many biblical scholars and theologians have pointed out, maybe reading these chapters as literally as you can isn't the best way of reading them. It isn't doing justice to the text itself and to what we think is the original intention of the text. So there you have it. I mean, I think that is very often what's going on. You have science, you have religion, but then there are, of course, people's interpretations of those, and that's where conflicts arise.
Very, very good. Thank you. So maybe a more epistemological question is in terms of the epistemic status of a discipline like theology. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, maybe most people, even theologians, they do not consider theology itself a science or a kind of scientific enterprise. So the question is, what kind of reliability, in epistemic reliability, does theology have? Does theology produce knowledge? Can we trust theology in any sense whatsoever? So what kind of insight epistemology could give us in this kind of discussion?
Yeah. So I think theology is a really interesting case because it's really, I mean, the academic discipline of theology, I mean, I agree that most theologians themselves wouldn't think of that as a science, or perhaps, in a very broad sense of science as like systematic inquiry that is practiced in universities. I mean, maybe they would want to agree with that, but certainly not natural science. But what's interesting about theology, I think, is that it's actually sort of a combination of many different academic methods and subdisciplines, right? So think about theology. What people do in theology is a lot of different things. Some people, study historical texts and really try and get at the original meaning or the how these texts arose in their current versions, what happened, developments historically. Theology is also studying the history of religions, studying the history of religious institutions. It's about the psychology and sociology of religion. It's about literary study, so thinking about the correct interpretations and meaning of ancient texts. So there's a lot of different things go on under the banner of theology, and I think what we can say about the epistemic status of theological claims is going to depend on all these different. I mean, there's no unique answer about the epistemic status of theology as a whole. I mean, it's going to be different for these different things that theologians do. And I think when you think about sort of the historical part of theology, well, the epistemic status of that often is just as good as other parts of history. I mean, history is hard, especially history of civilizations long ago or things that happened long ago, because evidence is often scarce. But of course, I mean, we think historians, do a pretty decent job of figuring out what happened a long time ago. I mean, nobody doubts like the history of Greek philosophy because it's so long ago. I mean, we have all these documents, so historians think about what went on in Greek philosophy. Similarly, for the Bible, we have these ancient texts. We have texts that are written at roughly the same times. So theologians, biblical scholars, think about these texts and their meaning and their origin stories. So I think, a lot of the criticisms of theology or the doubts about theology that people sometimes have really focus on systematic theology or dogmatics, right? When specific claims are made about religious doctrines, or maybe even about God's intentions and plans.
Yeah.
And here I think people are sort of right to be a bit doubtful or reluctant about the epistemic status of these claims, because I do think that the epistemic status of those claims isn't anywhere near that of, say, claims in biology or physics that are well established. It's a lot more uncertain. I think it's pretty much similar to claims that philosophers make. So when philosophers make claims about, whether a certain argument for or against free will is successful, they think really hard. They try and think carefully through the argument. They consider objections. They make distinctions. So they try to be as precise as they can, as careful as they can, and then they make a provisional claim. They think the argument works or it doesn't work. Well, the same is true, I think, in systematic theology or claims in dogmatics. When people make a claim about, say, the Trinity or the Incarnation, those are really, really difficult and abstract topics. So what you can do is think through the theories that there are, worries, objections, doubts, try and answer them as well as you can, and then draw a provisional conclusion. So is that going to be, a certain conclusion? No, of course not. But, it might be a justified one, a reasonable one, and that's still a positive epistemic status. It isn't as certain as the claims in some other disciplines, but it's still something, for sure.
Wow, that's very fascinating. Yeah, my training as a theologian, now looking back, I think that I lacked a kind of epistemological training that would be very, very helpful to theological reflections. Maybe this is, I think that all disciplines would benefit of epistemological training, right? So
of course,
we need much more epistemologists and jobs for epistemologists.
No, couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So very, very good. Well, maybe one of you are a political epistemologist, you are a social epistemologist, and you have been publishing very insightful and important papers, published books in very important themes. By the way, I have this amazing book that I won as a Christmas gift last year from you. a very, very good book. And it seems that what social epistemologists have been claiming in the last decades is that we live in a deeply socialized epistemological nature, or our knowledge in general is really socially embedded. So we profoundly depend on other people and on other communities to form our beliefs and opinions and judgments about, it seems, everything. And yes, and one new ingredient, not that new, but it's the internet, right? That has reshaped the ways in which we seek knowledge and understanding. And in the former days, there was this kind of euphoric view of the future, that the internet will be this amazing epistemic environment where all peoples of all places in the world would have access to the best views, the best theories, the best knowledge produced in the world. But it seems that things haven't gone exactly that way. So my very first broad question on this topic is the internet an epistemic blessing or a curse?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is, well, it's both,
Yeah.
right? If that's possible. I mean, when you think about it, it really is a blessing in the sense that it is a wonderful resource. I mean, if you know where to look, you can pretty much find you can find good quality information about any random topic you might think of. I mean, I don't know if you ever, I mean, I'm not like a very sort of practical person. It goes with the job of a philosopher, I guess. But I mean, sometimes things in our house break, right? Also because we have kids, but sometimes they just break. And exactly, right. And so when you need to fix an appliance or do some job, like so a while ago there was something with our washing machine. You go on YouTube and you look for the model, and you search for a specific problem that you have, and you will find some friendly washing machine mechanic who has made a video explaining the steps you should go through in order to fix something about your washing machine. I mean, it's amazing, right? And so it certainly is that. But of course, I mean, we all know, and we've seen so many examples of the past years of terrible information and people peddling conspiracy theories or outright lies on the internet, or people like forming communities where misinformation is spread and distributed, and people, and sometimes, I mean, this has even led to real violence. I mean, there's the well-known terrible story about Pizzagate, where someone who believed in a conspiracy theory actually stormed into a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. with the intention of killing people. And the whole thing was just made up. It was a conspiracy. It didn't exist. But this person believed in it, and as a result, he tried to kill people. So, I mean, yeah, that's a genuine worry, obviously.
Yeah, it seems that instead of people opening their minds and challenging some of their views that lacked evidence, sometimes the internet help people to become more dogmatically attached to their views, no matter if they have evidence or reasons to hold that.
So, I mean, so maybe the one quick thing here, and this is really something that the internet has made possible, I think. I mean, before the internet, when you had a bunch of crazy ideas about a conspiracy or a weird theory about the universe, it would just be you, right? And you might talk to people and they might tell you, that's crazy, you're not gonna nobody takes you seriously. But now there's the internet. You might be able to convince some people online, or you might be able to find a community of people who already believe in your crazy views. Or you might find these crazy views online and start believing in them for real. And of course, once you put people in a group with other people who think and believe roughly the same things, they're going to believe it more and more strongly, right? They're going to talk about it. They're going to think through the arguments they think there are for their views. And they end up convincing each other more and more strongly. And I mean, before the internet, that was just hard to do. You would have to, set up your own cult. Not a lot of people do that.
Yes, no, that's totally true. Related concern that the internet may bring is the notion of, as you call it, illusions in our understanding. So recently, you published a paper on this topic in an important journal called Social Epistemology, claiming that the internet may lead people, or in somehow lead people in these illusions of understanding. So could you briefly explain what is this illusions of understanding and how the internet can promote it?
Yeah, sure. So it's sort of, for me, it started with, and I guess this is an experience that is familiar to a lot of people. I mean, when you think back to high school, say, when, the moment when you understood how to solve a math problem, for example, or maybe, I mean, your favorite subject was history, and you finally saw like an important historical development or a connection between things, this feeling of understanding, of having figured something out. So the interesting thing is that's a real psychological phenomenon, and it's something that psychologists have studied. So people sometimes get this sense of understanding, this feeling that they really figured something out. So in the paper, I basically looked at how the internet and like the specific features of the way we interact with it might give you this sense of understanding of, this flash of insight feeling without there being actual understanding. And I think in a number of different ways, the internet sort of produces that feeling in us, even when we don't really understand things. So let me give you some examples. So when you go through a lot of information, you search information on Google, say. I mean, it's a very straightforward example. As you know, of course, you find tons of links. So you sort of browse through them, you scroll through them, you click on a few, and you open tabs and look at all that information. I mean, after a while, you really get the feeling that you've done some thorough research there, right?
Yeah.
Because, you clicked at a bunch of links, you read through Wikipedia and, a bunch of other web pages. But the point is, when you do this, there are no guarantees that the information you end up reading and processing is good quality, reliable information, because the way Google orders its search results is not at all epistemically optimal. Google doesn't look for the most reliable information and put it on top. Nobody really knows how Google orders this information, but certainly commercial interests are an important part of it. Companies can pay for their links to show up higher in the ranking. There's lots of factors that go into the algorithm that determines the order of search results. But it certainly has to do with commercial interests. So attracting attention because they're really trying to sell advertisements. So you get this feeling that you've processed a lot of information, but you may have been processing, 50% good information and 50% bad information, and your understanding might just be illusory, right? You might think you've understood, but really you haven't. So that's one example. And I think a similar thing can happen when you, say, follow recommended videos on YouTube, right? So you search for some information, and then YouTube always gives you these suggestions for what to watch next. So, maybe you're interested in a political problem and you look for a video of a politician explaining something or a political commentator explaining something. Then, the next videos might sort of continue on that topic, but what they might do is show you sort of more and more extreme takes on that political topic. So here too, if you follow these links and you sort of keep watching and clicking, after a while, you might have been sucked into this extreme or radical political rabbit hole, and you have the feeling that you've really watched a lot of information now, so now you finally understand. But in fact, you've become really biased in one direction. You've gotten a very one-sided take on a particular problem. And maybe one final example, a very, very simple one, in fact. Think about hyperlinks, right?
Yeah.
Wikipedia pages. We click on hyperlinks all the time.
Many tabs, many tabs.
Exactly, yeah. And what hyperlinks do is they suggest, of course, that there is some important connection between a word or a sentence and a topic. So you click to another page, and that page brings you to another page. So you get the sense that you're really discovering lots of interesting connections between different topics or between different people. Anyway, you're discovering connections is what's happening. But of course, when you understand a topic, when you really sort of have broad understanding of a topic, that also involves seeing lots of connections between the different aspects and the different parts of that topic, right? Someone who understands, say, a period of history very well knows how to draw connections between the things that happened and the people who did them. So understanding is about seeing connections. So what happens here is that you might mistake the connections that hyperlinks give you for connections that provide understanding. So again, you get this feeling that you've understood lots of things because you've explored all these connections through clicking hyperlinks. But again, no guarantee is that these are genuinely explanatory connections. So long story short, lots of ways in which the internet is designed and in which we interact with the internet sort of easily produce this feeling of understanding in us, even when we don't get real understanding.
Well, this is very, very important, and I think we all are prey sometimes of this kind of illusions of understanding, and this kind of reflection, like, helps us to be aware of these hidden mechanisms that run every time we are browsing, making a kind of searching in Google or YouTube that happens to be almost every day for many people. So that's very, very nice.
Yeah, and I mean, so maybe sort of a more hopeful thing to add here. I mean, I'm not saying this happens all the time and to everyone, and that it's hopeless. So it's not, a negative or depressing story. I mean, the message really is, I mean, as you say, we have to be aware of these mechanisms, and then sort of intentionally go against them, right? So make sure that we look for information that might provide another perspective on a topic. Make sure that we check the reliability of the sources that we click on. My point is just, these things don't happen automatically, so we have to be aware and we have to be intentional about it.
Yes, that's amazing. Well, we are having a kind of intellectual banquet, Professor. Thank you very much for sharing with us so much knowledge and understanding, and explaining at the same time in a deep level, but also in an accessible way, these very hard and important concepts. We are getting at the end of our conversation. So I have just a quick questions that you usually do, that it's funny to know a little bit from our interviewer, right? So, like, do you have top 3 non-academic books, right? Cannot be philosophical, nor theological, nor dissertations.
All right.
Maybe novels or poems. Top 3.
All right. Yeah. So this is, to be honest, this is a bit of a painful question for me because, I mean, first of all, I don't read as much novels or poems as I used to, and as I wish I would. And so also when I read them, oftentimes, in fact, they are Dutch novels, which I think would be sort of unavailable to your viewers. So I thought a bit about this, and I think, so one book, and I read it, I think over 10 years ago, but it really made an impression on me, is a novel by the British author Ian McEwan. It's called Atonement. And I mean, so Atonement is a really sort of deep and fascinating topic. And I think this novel does a wonderful job of, well, showing both the complexities that might sometimes be involved in atonement, people reconciling. But ultimately, it also, gives you a hopeful outlook on the possibility of atonement. So, So I'm not going to spoil it any further, but it's a novel that really sort of stuck with me. It made an impression.
I think it was like adapted as a movie, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Very, very nice. And I think, of
course, the book is better.
Yes, always. But I think another author that we interviewed also selected Atonement as one of his or her top books. Okay, and top movie, or maybe the top movie that you watch in this year, 2023.
Ooh.
Maybe the best one.
I don't know. Well, I mean, a lot of the movies I watch are basically children's movies because,
maybe you can recommend some.
Maybe one other also movie that was a book before, and it's a very, classic one, well-known one. A lot of people love it, but Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And here, definitely, read the book and forget about the movie. But yeah, it's just such an impressive and spectacular book. I mean, and to think that Tolkien really sort of invented this whole world it's amazing to me.
I am a Tolkien fan as well. I love it.
One final one, another book that really made a lasting impression on me. It's by a German author, Pascal Mercier, Night Train to Lisbon.
Night Train to Lisbon.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Lisbon is, yeah. And the author was actually, I think he died a couple of years ago, but he was a philosophy professor who also wrote novels. But it sort of shows. I mean, they're really sort of interesting novels with deep thinking sort of behind them.
I love it.
So he wrote a number of books, but I think Night Train to Lisbon is the one that really made him famous as a novelist. It's a really good one. He also has another one is called Perlman's Silence. And this is one that's a bit disturbing. So it's about an academic who basically runs out of things to say. So he is this really well-known professor who has to give a lecture at a big conference, but he has no ideas anymore. So he ends up stealing someone else's paper and plagiarizing, and it all goes downhill from there.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. Well, personally, I am passionate about novels. Every day I read a little bit before going to bed. It's kind of ritual for me.
Yeah, I try to do the same, but
yeah, not always, right? I have one kid and it's hard with 4. Oh my goodness. Yes. So, Professor, again, thank you very much. It was
You're welcome.
An honor for me personally and for our organization, that is Academia ABC², and our online magazine called Unus Mundus, like One World is the name of our online magazine, that we have papers, articles, and podcasts and interviewers like these, where it's all for free for our public to get access to reflections on the interface between the sciences, philosophy, and theology. So I'm sure that our conversation make a very great contribution to our journal. So thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yes. Pessoal, a gente fica por aqui. Espero que vocês tenham gostado e fiquem atentos às novidades na nossa revista Unus Mundus. Um abraço a todos.